Start with this.
Okay, now what we enter into the cranial cavity, and lying inside the skull, is the brain and meninges and CSF and the blood vessels and associated nerves. The topic of today is meninges, and before we start meninges, some of the facts you should know about the skull and the brain. Alright. Look, the interior of the skull is being divided into three fossas: anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and posterior cranial fossa. And look, in the anterior cranial fossa, over here you can see this crest, which is called as frontal crest, and this spine, which is called as cresta gyli. And just anterior to the cresta gyli, you can see this small foramen, which is foramen cecum. Foramen cecum and cresta gyli. Then you come over here, you can see these two processes. These are the anterior clinoid processes. And then these two processes, which are partially broken, you can see over here. This is anterior clinoid process, and these are posterior clinoid processes. And this fossa, we call it as sella turcica or pituitary fossa. And over here, lies the pituitary gland. Alright? Then coming back, this is the middle cranial fossa, and then you can see this big bone. This is the petrous part of the temporal bone. And at the top of the petrous part of temporal bone, you can see this groove. This is superior sagittal sinus. Okay? And then over here, you can see the posterior cranial fossa. And in the midline, the posterior cranial fossa, again you can see a crest, which is called an occipital crest, and one rounded elevation, which is called as internal occipital protuberance. Occipital crest and internal occipital protuberance. And then you can see this big groove, another one over here. This groove is for the transverse venous sinus. Alright. Keeping in view these points, now look, the brain lies inside this. And look, this is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe, it lies over here on this anterior cranial fossa, over here. And then you can see this temporal lobe. This temporal lobe lies over here in the middle cranial fossa. While this occipital lobe, you see over here, this one, this is concave, and it lies over here in the posterior cranial fossa. But you look, the two cerebellum, one lies over here and one lies over here, and this, you can see the two cerebellum, these are convex, being covered by a sheet of fascia, which is called a tentorium cerebelli. And this tentorium or sheet of dura mater, it separates this inferior concave surface of the occipital lobe from the cerebellum. And then you can see that the two cerebellar hemisphere, this is cerebellum, this is frontal lobe, and that is the temporal lobe, and this is the occipital lobe, and this is the median cleft between the two cerebelli. Look, this is the median cleft between the two cerebelli, right and left cerebral. No, median cleft between the two cerebral hemispheres. Sorry, one is right cerebral hemisphere and one is left cerebral hemisphere, and this is the median cleft. And you note one part over here at this point, that Over here, this is the corpus callosum, which connects the two cerebral hemisphere with one another, and this corpus callosum is convex superiorly. You can see. Okay, the same you can see over here in this actual brain. Look, this is the frontal lobe, and this is the temporal lobe, and this is the occipital lobe. And you can see the occipital lobe is being related to one cerebellum hemisphere and another cerebral hemisphere. That's why this inferior surface of the occipital lobe, it is concave, being related to the convex superior surface of the two cerebellum. And then you can see, look, this is, look, you can see this is the midbrain, and this is the pons, and this is the medulla oblongata. Midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. This midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Look over here, please. Again, you can see this is midbrain, and this is pons, and this is medulla oblongata. This is being related to this part of the skull, that is to this basilar part of occipital bone, and then this medulla oblongata become continuous through the foramen magnum with this spinal cord. Okay, these are the few facts which we will teach arrayed separately, but to understand the meninges, these were necessary. Alright. Now, look, this is the hard skull, and look, this is the soft brain. It lies inside the skull. So, with movements of the skull, this brain can be injured. That's why what Allah has provided, what the great Allah has provided, that the brain is being covered in three membranes. The outer membrane, this is the brain. The outer membrane, this is the dura mater. Then in contact and very close to the dura mater is the arachnoid matter. And then the brain surface is very closely covered by a pia mater. In this way, three membranes, the outer one, three membranes of fibrous tissue. The outer one is the dura, the innermost one is the pia, and the intermediate one is the arachnoid matter. The arachnoid remains in contact with the dura, and the space between the two is just a potential space which is being called a subdural space. The space between the dura and arachnoid, this is subdural space, while the space between the arachnoid and pia is a wide space which is being called a subarachnoid space. This subarachnoid space is being filled with a fluid which is being called as cerebrospinal fluid. Now these three layers of meninges, pia, arachnoid and dura, and this space filled with the CSF, it provides a cushion which protects the brain to be being injured with the hard brain. This cushion-like mechanism, it prevents the brain to be hit with the skull bones during movements of the skull. And then the dura mater, it sends septa. The dura comes like this, and then it passes in and then comes out. In this way, one septum, in this way, many septa are being provided by the folding in and out of dura mater between the different parts of the brain. And these folds, what is the special mechanism of these folds? That while there is vigorous movements of the skull, the rotated displacement of the brain is being displaced and rotated. And that's why at that time it is very important that some mechanism should prevent this rotated displacement of the brain from its own place to be heated with the skull bones. So these phalanges of the dura mater, it prevents the rotative displacement of the brain, and then it is being prevented to be injured. In this way, Allah has provided us, our brain is being protected, number one, by the skull, and number two, by the three meninges, and then the CSF cushion, and then lastly, the folds of dura mater that lies between the different parts of the brain, and that prevents the rotative displacement. Okay, now let us describe the meninges. The outermost layer of the meninges, which is being called as dura mater, it is a thick fibrous membrane. You can see what over here. This thick fibrous membrane, this is the dura mater, and then just in contact with the dura mater is the arachnoid matter, which we can't separate, and then lastly you can see on the surface of the brain, closely on the surface of the brain, you can see this thin membrane. Just look at it, this thin membrane. This is the pia mater. Is it clear in view? साफ है ना इधर से? This is the pia mater, this thin membrane. Look, over here we have removed. You can see the gray matter, and over here it is present. Over here it is present. This thin membrane is the pia mater, which is in close contact. This thin membrane, you can see, which is in close contact with the brain tissue. Alright. So describing the dura mater is a thick fibrous membrane, and anatomist has described in a way that the dura mater consists of two layers. The outer layer is called as endosteric layer, and the inner layer is called as meningeal layer of dura mater. Note one point. The dura mater people also call as pachymeninges, while the arachnoid matter and the pia mater combinedly people call it as leptomeninges. Leptomeninges consist of pia and arachnoid, while the dura mater separate is being called as the pachymeninges. Now the dura mater consists of two layers. The outer layer are endosteric layer, and the inner layer are meningeal layer. Look, the outer layer or endosteric layer is actually this inner periosteum of the bone. You know, although the bones are being covered by the periosteum, the skull bone is being covered by the periosteum on the outer side as well as on the inner side. And this periosteum on the inner side, this one, it is being called as industrial layer of the dura mater. I think this is just a periosteum of the bone, and that's why it doesn't deserve the name of to describe it as the dura mater, but the older anatomists have described, we can't change, but this is not very much correct. This is just periosteum, and you can see this periosteum is the bone, and this periosteum is being continuous at the foramina with the outer periosteum, and while the nerves, cranial nerves, come out of this industrial layer, it does not form any fold around the nerves. That's why it is just a periosteum, but people call it as industrial layer of the dura mater. Anyhow, now the inner layer, which is a thick fibrous membrane, it is the actual dura mater, and which is called as meningeal layer of dura mater, but it is the actual dura mater. Now this dura mater, it lines the skull from the inside. All the skull, this one as well as this one, it is being lined by this thick sheet of dura mater, which is called as meningeal layer of dura mater, or which is called as actual dura mater or fibrous dura mater. and it lies the inner surface of the skull as well as the inner surface of the base of the skull. Everywhere this industrial layer or periosteum and the dura mater, they are being fused with one another, except at some places, for example, over here in this area you can see this groove. Over here the two layers are being separated from one another, or over here you can see in this area where there is a groove, and in this area and so many other where the venous channels are present between this industrial layer and the fibrous layer, or somewhere this venous channel are present only between the fibrous layer, and that is being called as venous sinuses. Venous sinuses will describe separately, don't worry, but only the point to be clarified that the industrial layer and the fibrous layer, they are being fused with one another except at the channels where the venous sinuses are being present, and those channels, the two layers being separate from one another. Then the fibrous layer, the meningeal layer of dura mater, it is being loosely attached to the industrial layer at the top of the skull, while at the base of the skull it is very tightly adherent. Allah has made it so good that when you want to do operation and you remove the part of the skull, the dura mater is easily being separated, while on the base of the skull you can't separate it easily. That's why for surgeon it is very easy when we do some operation over here and the dura mater can be separated. So the fibrous and industrial dura mater, these are being fused with one another except at the venous channel areas. Okay, then what happens? Look, what happens? Look, the dura mater, it covers this area, and then when it reaches into the cleft between the two, look, it enters over here and again come out over here like this, and then it covers this another hemisphere. In this way, a fold of dura mater lies between these two cerebral hemispheres. In this way, many folds are being present, and these folds of dura mater, which I discussed earlier, they prevents the rotative displacement of the brain tissue while movement of the skull, at the movement of the skull. Alright, now one of the fold of dura mater present between the two cerebral hemispheres, this fold of dura mater, look, the dura mater comes like this, enters into it, and then again comes over here like this. In this way, this fold is being present over here between the two cerebral hemispheres, and this fold of dura mater, double-layered fold of dura mater between these two cerebral hemispheres, this is being called as falx cerebri. F-A-L-X, falx cerebri. This falx cerebri, and you know already that the corpus callosum is concave superiorly. That's why the falx cerebri, which is in contact with the corpus callosum between these two cerebral hemispheres, it must be concave because it is in contact with the convex corpus callosum. And note another point, that this is the falx cerebri between the two cerebral hemispheres. Its inferior margin is concave, because it is in contact with the convex cerebral hemisphere. Its anterior border is narrow and short, while its posterior border is broad. Look, this is the falx cerebri, this one, this fold. This is the dura mater on this hemisphere, this is the dura mater on this hemisphere, and this sickle-shaped fold of dura mater, narrow at the anterior end and broad at the posterior end, and convex at the superior margin and concave at the inferior margin, lying between the two cerebral hemispheres. This is being called as falx cerebri. Now you look over here. Look, this is the actual falx cerebri. Look, this is the anterior end, and this broad is the posterior end. The inferior margin is concave while the superior margin is convex, and it is a double layered fold lying between the two cerebral hemispheres. Anteriorly, this narrow end of the falx cerebri is being attached to the crista galli and the frontal crest. Some of the fibers may enter into this foramen cecum, and these fibers, if enter into the foramen cecum and are being attached over here, these are being called as Sharp's fibers. Okay, so the anterior end is being attached to this frontal crest, crista galli, and some fiber into the Sharp's fibers. Then it passes upward in a convex manner. You can see. Then it passes upward in a convex manner, and one layer is this one on this cerebral hemisphere, one is on this cerebral hemisphere, and between these two layers and this groove of the skull at the midline on the top of the skull over here like this, and these two layers of dura mater, this combinedly encloses over here the venous channel which is called as superior sagittal sinus. Look again, just to make you understand, it's easy. Look, this is one cerebral hemisphere, dura mater of this, and this is another cerebral hemisphere. Look, this is fold of dura mater between the two cerebral hemispheres. This covers this one and this covers this one. Okay, anteriorly it is being attached to the crista galli, while over here look like this. Look, it is covered, and at the midline and the inner surface there is a groove. So the groove and this channel between the two layers of dura mater, this channel which is being formed, that is being called as superior sagittal sinus. Posteriorly, look, alright, so the falx cerebri is a sickle-shaped fold, double-layered fold of dura mater lying between the two cerebral hemisphere, anteriorly narrow, being attached to the anterior frontal crest and crista galli, and superiorly the two layers are being separated from one another, and over here they are in contact with the groove on the inner surface of this groove and the inner surface of this middle line of the vault of the skull, and this combined form this superior sagittal sinus. Look, the posterior end is broad. Look, this is broad. I have made it like over here. The posterior end is broad. And note, over here present in the posterior cranial fossa is another fold. This is being called as, this fold is being called as tentorium cerebelli. This broad posterior end is being attached to this superior surface of tentorium cerebelli. Okay. This attachment of the falx cerebelli to this upper surface of tentorium cerebelli, number one, it anchors or it suspends this tentorium and do not allow it to fall downward. And number two, between, look, between these two layers, like this, over here, and between these two layers over here, like this. Look, like this. Over here, please make it close. A venous channel is being formed over here, and this venous channel over here between these two layers of the tentorium and the two layers of the falx cerebri. Over here, the venous channel which is being formed, that is being called a straight sinus. And at the inferior margin, look, then the two layers over here, they are being fused with one another. But at the inferior concave margin, again the two layers separate from one another, and over here it closes a channel in between the two layers, and this is being called as inferior sagittal sinus. Okay, I hope you have understand something. Okay, but don't worry, I make it more clear. Now look at this book. You can see this is half. This sickle shaped fold of dura mater, this is falx cerebri, anterior and narrow, posterior and broad. And the superior border enclose the superior sagittal sinus, and the inferior border enclose the inferior sagittal sinus. In between the superior and inferior, the two layers are fused. The posterior broad and it being attached with the upper surface of tentorium cerebelli, and over here this straight sinus, straight venous sinus, you can see it contains venous blood, and anteriorly it is being attached to the crista galli and the frontal crest. I hope now it will be clear. Alright. Now another fold of dura mater, this is posterior canal fossa, and over here lies the one cerebellum and another cerebellum, two cerebellum lies over here. And look, again, this is petrous part of temporal bone, this one and this one. And this is internal occipital protuberance, this is the internal crest. Look, the dura mater comes over here. When it reaches over here, it is being reflected like that. And the dura mater that comes from above, when it is over here, it is also reflected. I give the example like this, that one fold comes like this and become reflected like this. And the other comes from over here and reflected like this. In this way, a double-layered fold is being formed from one wall to another, a sheet, a double-layered fold from one wall to another, and this posterior part of the room is being separated from this superior part, this inferior part from this superior part. In the same way, the cavity of the posterior canal fossa, it is being tented, it is being tented by this double-layered fold. Look, one layer is this one and one is one, and it's like this. The dura mater coming from over here, it gets reflected, and coming from over here, it also gets reflected. In this way, double-layered fold is being formed, which at the margins over here is attached to the periphery of the skull, and then this is being attached to the apex of petrous part of the temporal bone, and anteriorly it is being attached to the posterior and anterior cranial process. Okay, and this double-layered fold of dura mater that make a tent over the posterior cranial fossa and separate the two cerebellum from the cerebellum from this inferior concave surface of the occipital lobe. So over here is the cerebellum, then it is being covered by this tentorium cerebelli, and then over here is the inferior surface of the occipital lobe. The two are being separated from one another by this tentorium. Now look again, I told you that this is an internal occipital protuberance, and this groove that you can see, this is transverse sinus, and this you can see at the apex, at the petrous part of temporal bone, this is, you can see, is the sigmoid sinus. So this double-layered fold which is being attached at the periphery, it is being attached, the two layers are being attached over here to the margins, to this upper margin and lower margin of the straight sinus. In this way, between at the margins between the two layers of the tentorium cerebelli, over here is present the straight sinus, and laterally, because it is being attached over here to the petrous part of temporal bone. You can see to this part over here. So in this way, over here between the two layers is being enclosed this superior sagittal segments, the superior it's which sinus? Okay, this sinus, and over here is being enclosed the straight sinus between the two layers of the tentorium cerebelli. Now look, the anterior margin of the tentorium, it is free and U-shaped, and this U-shaped groove at the anterior margin of the tentorium. This is being called as tentorial notch, or also called as tentorial incisor. It lies over here, and you can see this midbrain and this pons, they are being related over here to this tentorium, because that lies over here and that the notch lies over here. Now again, the tentorium is attached posterolaterally to the margins of the transverse sinus, and over here it is being attached to the margins of the superior petrosal sinus, while the anterior margin is free and U-shaped, called a tentorial notch or tentorial incisor. And now this free anterior border, it is being attached to this posterior clinoid process, and then you can follow it over here up to this anterior clinoid process. Okay, and to this upper surface, as I have told you already, to this upper surface, over here at the midline is being attached the broad posterior end of the falx cerebri. This is the attachment of tentorium cerebelli and its situation, and the venous sinus is being included in it. Okay, and over here in this area, you can see this small fossa, this one. It is being called as trigeminal fossa, or also being called as trigeminal cave. A fold of diaphragm also lies over here to form this trigeminal fossa or trigeminal cave, and then followed anteriorly, it is being attached to this anterior clinoid process. Okay, and this tentorium over here separates the two cerebelli from the inferior surface of the occipital lobe, and these two sinuses are being enclosed in the two layers of the tentorium cerebelli. Alright. Then the third fold of the dura mater is the falx cerebelli, that is tentorium cerebelli, and this one is the falx cerebelli. You know, over here lies one cerebellum, and the another cerebellum lies over here. You can see, and the dura mater comes over here. It elevates like this for a while, and then comes like this, and then again become in this way a small fold of dura mater between the two cerebral hemispheres. Look, dura mater comes like this, ascends, and then again descends, and then comes. And this way, over here between the two cerebellar hemisphere is a fold of dura mater that is being called as falx cerebelli. And the venous sinus, which is being present over here between the two layers at the occipital crest, this is being called as occipital sinus. Okay, all right. This is the third, and then you can see over here, this is the pituitary fossa. This is area of one cavernous sinus. This is another cavernous sinus, and it's a anterior clinoid process and posterior clinoid process. Over here, a fold of dura mater lies over here at the roof of the pituitary fossa, at the roof. And this roof and this fold of dura mater that lies at the roof of the pituitary fossa, that is being called as diaphragma cilia. and this is being pierced, this roof or this folded matter, it is being pierced by the stalk of the pituitary gland. In this way, four folds, falx cerebelli, tentorium cerebelli, and diaphragma silly. Okay, and in this way you can see some of the venous sinuses are present between, for example, you can see over here, this venous sinus, superior sinus is being present between the fibrous, the industrial layer and the fibrous layer. While the inferior sinus, okay, over here, look, this venous sinus, it is being present only between the two meningeal layer of the dura mater, while the superior sinus, it is being present between the industrial layer and the fibrous layer. Okay, now this, look, this is being the dura mater is having a rich blood supply and nerve supply. But it is said that the blood supply of this industrial layer is much more than the fibrous layer, because it is fibrous tissue, it does not require much, blood. Then another point, that look, over here lies the tentorium cerebelli. So some part of the brain lies behind inferior to tentorium cerebelli and some lies superior, and that's why it is being called as supratentorial compartment and infratentorial compartment. Infratentorial compartment is over here in the posterior cranial fossa. There are the two cerebelli and some parts of the hindbrain, while the supratentorial compartment is that lies superior to this tentorium cerebelli. Then the blood supply is from these meningeal arteries. Look over here, you can see this is the middle meningeal artery, ascending pharyngeal artery, ophthalmic arteries, and branches of vertebral arteries in the posterior cranial fossa. Different arteries supplies the dura mater and the dura mater, and the blood supply is more directed toward this industrial layer than the fibrous layer. And then the nerve supply is also rich nerve supply, and in the supratentorial part, that is above the tentorial cerebelli, it is more supplied by the ophthalmic division of trigeminal nerve. Okay, and the anterior cranial fossa is being supplied by anterior posterior ethmoidal nerve and receive tweaks from the maxillary nerve. The middle cranial fossa is being supplied by maxillary nerve, and the posterior cranial fossa is being supplied maxillary nerve and meningeal other branches of in the posterior cranial fossa by these meningeal branches of the hypoglossal and vagus nerve, and some fibers are coming directly from the C1 and C2 as well. This is nerve supply, you study that. The point now another is to be described, that you look, this is the industrial layer, and let me say, look, this is the meningeal layer. The brain covered by this meningeal layer, brain is being covered by this meningeal layer, and this meningeal layer of dura mater, it is being in contact with this industrial layer. Okay, between this meningeal layer and industrial layer, over here lies, you can see this artery, you can see this middle meningeal artery. If the middle meningeal artery is being ruptured and there is a bleeding and hematoma accumulates over here between this fibrous, this meningeus layer and the industrial layer, then the people call it as extradural hemorrhage. Otherwise, if we consider this industrial layer as the dura mater, then it should be called as subdural. But people call it as extradural hemorrhage. That's why it is properly that the proper dura mater is only this meningeal layer. Okay, thank you. This is all about the dura mater. Thank you very much.